Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Keith Bybee, and I direct the Institute for the Study of Judiciary, Politics, and the Media here at SU. And today we have our third speaker in our annual spring speaker series on law, politics, and the media. This series is sponsored by IJPM and the Tully Center for Free Speech, which is directed by that man over there, the guy who floats my boat, the man who makes my elevator rise, Roy Gutterman. As part of this series, we bring out a range of practitioners from the bench, the bar, the world of policymaking, and news media to address issues that fall under the broad umbrella of law, politics, and the media. And today our speaker is Mark Obbie. Mark currently works as a freelance journalist who focuses on criminal justice policy. His writing has appeared most recently in the New York Times, in Slate, in The Atlantic, in Vice. He's had long-form, these are often long-form, deeply informative, deeply reported pieces. Mark has got a long career in journalism. He has served as a reporter for the Houston Post. He was editor and publisher of the Texas Lawyer newspaper and served for a number of years as executive editor of the American Lawyer magazine. Mark also was on faculty here at SU. He taught at the Newhouse School as a professor of magazine journalism and was there for 8 years, which is great, fantastic. And during that time, Mark participated in the founding of IJPM. So he was here at the beginning when we were sort of grappling with ideas and what the shape that the Institute would take. And periodically, since Mark left the university, we've been able to lure him back to give lectures, and we're really delighted to have him here today. The title of his lecture is Victim Mentality: How Media Portrayals of Crime Victims Contribute to Distortions That Affect Public Opinion and Policies on Crime and Punishment. Just a few comments about how we'll proceed today before I turn things over to Mark. Mark will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of our time until 5 o'clock as Q&A with the audience. If you have a chance, I please encourage you to stick around after 5 because we'll be bringing plenty of food and drink into the room for a small reception, and it's an opportunity for a continued conversation with our distinguished speaker. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mark Obbie.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and I forgot to tell you, Keith, that I had shortened that horribly long subtitle. I could have saved you a few words there. Well, it's a pleasure to be back, especially in this beautiful building, which I had not seen. And I think you topped Newhouse 3, where I had my office for the last few years that I was here. It's a pleasure to be back here. I want to start out with a little mental exercise to talk about, to get us into our conversation about media coverage of crime and crime victims and the policies surrounding these issues. I'd like to think a little more deeply about crime victims than we tend to do. And I want to start out, I'm going to put some people on the spot if nobody raises their hand to volunteer. So I'm going to throw out a few types of victims, a few experiences that victims might have, victims of crime, and ask you to think about where on the spectrum of deserving to undeserving, from good victims to bad victims, the people we sympathize with and the people whom we blame for their plight. Think about where these types of victims fall on the spectrum. And this is obviously just pure reaction. I'm not asking for any data to back it up, but I'd like you to explain why you think somebody falls on the spectrum there. So the first one, the gut question, is a child abused by a caretaker. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, but a case of child abuse, where would this victim fall on the spectrum? And why? Can you explain thoughts about why you feel that way? Good. Those are a lot of the criteria that we think about when we think about innocence and victims. A tourist shot in a robbery. Where on the spectrum is the tourist shot in a robbery. Is he a 10? Is he a 9? What if he's wandering into a sketchy neighborhood? He's been warned by the hotel. Well, maybe you better not walk down that street, but it's Mardi Gras and he's going to go. What then? Does he move a little bit farther down the spectrum here? Maybe he's an 8. What if the tourist is robbed on his way to scoring some weed so that he can really enjoy Mardi Gras? He's a
10 plus.
Where does that put him? Does he move farther down for any particular reason?
In some cases, you would follow.
Me? Lewis? Come, you're misbehaving already, Lewis. What's the thinking, though, that is behind moving that person, somebody who has gone out to commit an offense, depending on what state we're talking about? Why do we think that person is less deserving, is less innocent, if the crime that he was going to commit did not automatically subject him to a crime of violence?
Is it a worse crime or a worse crime? The fact that he was going to go score, and now he gets banged. Does that make him less innocent?
Well, that's the question.
No.
But
there's more risk if you're going to meet somebody.
so he's assumed some risk.
Right. So, and that's something, a choice that he's made.
So he's made a personal choice. He's taken on some risk. And we think, maybe we don't say it this way, but a lot of us just think less of him. Well, what do you expect? You went into that neighborhood, you're looking for trouble. That's what you get. Let's take a few harder examples. A gang member in the business of selling weed who's shot by a rival. He's shot. He's a victim of gun violence. And he's where does he fall on the spectrum compared to the tourist who decided he needed a little joy in his life one night? But where does the guy who's in business of doing this and who gets shot in a business dispute, does that change the equation? What do you think? What number would you give that guy and why?
I would give him a 1. Sorry, because he's intentionally putting himself in that situation. Therefore, there's a higher probability that he will be shot or something else would happen.
He should have known better. We don't have a lot of sympathy for him. A lot of people might say, well, this is just sort of natural selection, taking care of weeding out the people we don't care about a whole lot anyway.
Didn't we say with the tourist that the tourist was warned he was going into a bad area and he still went to a bad area and then got robbed? So it wasn't the same exact life because basically he was warned he was going into a bad business. So I'd give it maybe 1 less than whatever we gave it.
All right, so maybe the gradations are a little tighter there when you think about what gets people into these situations. A prison inmate serving time for tax evasion who gets raped. You know, prison rape, we've turned it into a joke. It's a long-standing punchline. You commit a crime, you're gonna get your just desserts when you go to prison because you deserve whatever you get. But tax evasion, conviction, go to prison, get raped. Where does that victim fall? And what is our reaction to that person here?
I'd probably say like a 6. I mean, I feel for the guy. He's serving time, and the punishment imposed on him was something that could be expected for the type of conduct and crime he was engaging in, tax evasion. But I don't think it's necessary or deserving for him to have a rape punishment as that imposed on him. So
the connection between those two things doesn't. It's not the same as maybe somebody who's in the drug business who gets into a fight with another drug dealer. And here, there's a distance between what he did and what we decide is fair or unfair treatment of him. Sanjay?
Would you be thinking about this like the kid in the child care situation where this person doesn't have choice over the conditions of the confinement are and their physical safety is entrusted.
Good question. Good question. Do you think most people make that fine distinction? I think a lot of people hear about a gang member or a prisoner and they just think, well, that's not a real crime victim. That's not a truly innocent, blameless crime victim. But it's a good question about, how we view these situations and how we think about these people. Where I'm going with this is that we do make these judgments, whether we vocalize them, and certainly some do. If you ever decide to sully yourself by reading the comments on stories about sentencings or arrests, on stories about crime, the Post-Standard is a lovely cesspool of thought in the comments. But people do make these judgments, moral judgments, all the time. And there's a lot, it's human nature to think this way. It's cultural, but it also is a function of what we see and read and think, what we consume in our news media, which is where I want to go with this. Those judgments might make some logical sense if justice is defined as punishment. If that's really what justice is, we measure the degree of justice by the degree of punishment, then maybe that makes some sort of sense that we're setting up a hierarchy of victims. We're thinking about people in different degrees of innocence, different degrees of deserving what they get. It might not make as much sense if justice isn't necessarily defined only as punishment. If justice is righting a wrong and preventing wrongs, then these sorts of distinctions may not make nearly as much sense. I started out my career covering cops in courts, and with emphasis on the cops part. The cliche about my business is that if it bleeds, it leads. It means that especially these days when local news budgets have been cut so much because advertising has dried up, it's cheap. It's good ratings. It's an anchor in newspapers and on websites. It is what people expect. They want to know what's going on in their city, but it's also a form of entertainment in a way that we keep up with. Every little shooting, every event that might scare people is going to make the top of the news, regardless of what kind of crime it is. It is a staple of the news. But let's think about for a second how journalists define news and how they think their audience wants news defined. Is that which is rare, that which is unusual, the aberration. When something is unusual enough to get our attention, because it doesn't happen every day, because it isn't so common, that becomes more newsworthy than the everyday, the commonplace. But when it comes to violence, that means that we might overemphasize certain kinds of violence, mass murder, mass shootings, spectacular kinds of crimes, certain kinds of victims who really get our attention. That might get a lot of attention where we get really inured to the everyday violence, the everyday kinds of crimes that are not defined as newsworthy because, a few more people in a bad neighborhood got shot. It happens every day. It's not as big a news story. When I covered police in Houston, Texas in the 1980s, there were more than 700 murders a year, which is far more now than what New York City has. It's about what Chicago has now, which has alarmed the nation. And a typical Friday night might feature 7 or 8 murders when I was covering police for a good long while. And so we would actually play this game of figuring out which murder did we have time to go see. Oh, there's 2 there. That's better than the 1 there. But that's in a rich neighborhood, so that's more unusual. That's pretty exciting, as opposed to this place where the cops are saying it was just a couple guys on the street corner feuding with each other. These sorts of judgments really do go into making news judgments. They are not easily defensible. They often are loaded with racial implications, but they are a natural byproduct of limited resources, figuring out what people are interested in. But these things have grave implications on the way that messages about the value of victims gets communicated to the public, and that in turn has implications for public policy, which is where I want to go with this. I spent some time looking into the mugshots industry and how it uses mugshots not only to extort money from people who've been arrested for any number of offenses. Then you're told you can pay $300 and you can get your you can get your mugshot taken down from this particular website. It's extortion. But not only that, but there are not so much in this state because the police are actually more restrictive in how they release mugshots than in places like Florida, for example, where every night they upload the sheriff's department will upload all the mugshots. The news sites or the mugshot websites harvest them, publish them, and it's a business. It drives a lot of traffic. It drives a lot of ugly commentary about who these people are in the mugshots. It's a form of public shaming, and it all is because people like to think about crime as a moral tale. It is obviously it asks moral questions, but the news media's role in this, at least certain segments of the news media, exploit these feelings and leave us with messages that have big implications in how we deal with the public policy questions. After Newtown, in which 20 children plus 6 adults were killed, we as a country had no problem seeing our way to helping those victims' families with vast amounts of money and gifts of all kinds. And this is not a made-up number, about 65,000 teddy bears. Somebody, I guess, had an idea that these families could use teddy bears. So, and I don't in any way mean to denigrate their pain because it was a horrible, horrible crime. But the point is, when certain kinds of events happen that really hit us, that really get our attention and that really tug at those emotions, then we have absolutely no trouble seeing our way to helping those families in ways that will probably vastly outstrip whatever financial need they would have that came from the loss of a child. Other types of victims who number in much, much greater numbers don't necessarily get that kind of help. This website called Gun Violence Archive keeps track of, as best it can, of these sorts of numbers in real time. These are the year-end numbers for 2016. I will caution you that the number of gun violence injuries is vastly understated. The shame of it is that in this country, we do not systematically count the number of people who are shot but survive. We don't know the number. The CDC's best estimate is that it's 70 to 80,000 a year, but that's just a guess based on news reports, based on lots of other pieces of bad data. We just don't even bother to count the number of people who are wounded in gun violence. But the deaths are real numbers, and they include. These do not include suicide, by the way. There are about 22,000 suicides on top of these numbers on an annual basis. These are way down, of course, from when crime was at its peak in the late 80s, early 90s. But you can see the number of children killed or injured in a year, the number of teens, 12 to 17, 3,116. We're talking big numbers, and so it's almost an overwhelming task for people you can't care as much about every single one of those people as you can for every one of those children in Newtown. But by not having any sort of proportionality there, we set ourselves up to have a hierarchy that rewards certain victims while others go wanting. It is a fact in this country that the typical gun violence victim, who is typically a young black male, is going to get emergency care, of course, but afterward is going to, assuming no decent insurance, no other independent financial means from the government, from anywhere else, just family and friends, people with the most grievous kinds of injuries, paralysis, brain injuries, abdominal injuries, just incapacitating, will live the rest of their lives half repaired, never actually getting the kind of physical rehabilitation that they need, because we don't bother to put any money into those sorts of things. Only thanks to the Affordable Care Act do more people get some medical care, but they don't get nearly what they need. We say we care about crime victims, and we do care about certain kinds of crime victims, but the most common crime victims get the back of our hand when they have an actual out-of-pocket hard cost that they of the kinds of help that they need. That doesn't even count the kinds of help that that we know would make a huge difference in preventing crime. And in a little bit, I'll talk about preventive methods that would make a real difference in urban violence. But we know that that victims of trauma, childhood trauma, witnessing or experiencing violence, there's a straight line from that to committing offenses or to repeat victimization as they age. It's just a part of the experience, and it means that people, if there were interventions early on in their experience, when you know that a child has been abused or has witnessed violence in the home, witnessed violence in the streets, when you know that, and if you actually dealt with it and provided counseling and helped people deal with that, they might not act out the way that they are going to act out because they are traumatized. These sorts of things don't get hardly any attention, hardly any money in this country, despite having billions of dollars in victim assistance and having the resources that we apply to other parts of the criminal justice system, namely in prisons. Just a couple. Throw a few stats at you. You'd probably know a lot of these numbers, and some of them came up in the Lois Beckett article in ProPublica. But the most at-risk victims of violence are young black males, 21 times more likely to die in gun violence. Homicide, the leading cause of death for black people in that age group, black males in that age group, the leading cause. That's attention-getting. Unsolved murder rates have gone way up in recent years. Even though there are far fewer murders nationwide than there were 20 years ago, we're solving many fewer homicides. There are a lot of theories about why that is, fewer police resources being one of the leading causes. There's a great book called Ghettocide that really explains that phenomenon and talks about how it might be addressed. But the unsolved murder racial disparity is huge, where black homicide is far less, has a far lower clearance rate, clearance meaning solved by police in some form or fashion. But we know that certain kinds of victims are going to suffer in anonymity. It's a fact that 47% of victims of violence do not report their crimes to police. A big reason for that is that a lot of violence is interpersonal, intra-family violence. And so there are lots of complications in reporting that to police, but that's not the only reason. It has a lot to do with trust in police. Trust that the police will actually do something about it, that they'll actually bother to solve the crime, that they will care enough about those victims to do that. This is one of the major causes of urban violence, is that people have decided that they will take law into their own hands because they don't have trust, they don't have faith in the police to solve their problems. The non-reporting rate for other kinds of crimes is even higher than these numbers. The victims movement started when crime really went up in the 60s and 70s, and at first it was about getting respect for crime victims who had really just been seen as an appendage to the prosecution in criminal cases. Mothers Against Drunk Driving was one of the trailblazing victim advocacy groups working for notification rights, for a right of access to the courtroom, to talk to the judge at sentencing, to be in front of parole boards, to make their case, to be informed of the status of a prisoner's, whether a prisoner has been released or not. But the victims movement gradually became an arm of tough-on-crime politics. The political gain that could be made from warning about violence, from raising fear about violence, and violence was really high, and it was a huge problem. But the political capital that could be gained by holding up victims and saying, look what happened to this person, we need to increase penalties, we need to fill the prisons with far more people, which we very successfully did starting in this time frame, the 70s and 80s, meant that victims like Polly Klaas, the little girl here on the left, would inspire California's notorious three strikes law. And Adam Walsh, his father, America's Most Wanted guy, inspired sex offender registries in this country. There are tons of laws that were named specifically, explicitly, for victims of particular kinds of horrifying crimes, and the victims movement became the face of the political effort to ramp up punishment in this country, demanding that we, the public, take sides. We are either pro-victim or we are pro-criminal defense rights, and sometimes that's shortened. I follow a lot of the commentary on the tough-on-crime side, and it's just shortened to pro-criminal. You're either pro-victim or you're pro-criminal, and they don't mean that with irony. The natural allies for the victims group became prosecutors and police, often for legitimate reasons. They would see what the victims were going through. They were the closest to this pain outside of the direct victim and family, but they made common cause with victims. And so what we have, and I'm sorry you probably can't see those numbers, but I'll explain them. What that and all these other factors about anger, about crime have done is amp up the public sentiment, the fears of crime. The top chart shows the most recent survey by Gallup. 53% of people surveyed by Gallup in a nationwide survey said that they worry a great deal about crime, and it reached a 15-year high just this past year. But it's always been rather high, 62% back in 2001, and then bouncing around down there, but it's gone up more recently. The second chart shows that 70% of people believe crime is rising, and they have believed that pretty consistently for the past several years, even though we have been in the midst of an historic drop in crime in this nation. Across the board, all kinds of crime in almost all places. Crime has gone way, way down from what it used to be. That's what this shows. And I'm going to get to what's been happening most recently in just a second. These numbers are from the Pew Research Center, showing violent crime per 100,000 residents, violent victimization per 1,000 people, property crimes, property victimizations, but all sorts of crime, all making historic drops over the past 20, 25 years. Most recently, and this is what we've been hearing a lot about, there have been spikes in murder rates and in assaults in many big cities, not in citywide, but in particular neighborhoods of particular cities. While some cities have experienced continued improvement in their crime rates, New York is the shining example. It's just amazing what has happened in New York in crime rates, but not in every single neighborhood, but citywide. We've seen double-digit increases in the murder rate in Chicago and in 12 other cities, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. Overall crime is flat, pretty much flat. Violent crime overall has taken an increase, but we are still near those 30-year lows, but that bounce near the bottom of the curve has really alarmed a lot of people. And it has made those neighborhoods where this violence occurs that much more dangerous, that much more hopeless seeming. And that is real. And there are real victims there who, hundreds of thousands of people have been spared death and injury since crime began falling 20, 25 years ago. Hundreds of thousands of lives that otherwise would have been lost if we had kept those murder rates constant. But every time that there's a 14% increase in murder, that means many more people. So what are the real solutions to crime that are based on quality studies? I wrote a long, I was kind of mad at my editors. They called it the Wonk's Guide to, don't read me. That says don't read me. The Wonk's Guide to Policing something at the Trace. The Trace covers gun violence. But I spent months going through voluminous studies. There's been a revolution in criminology over the past 10, 15 years, moving from a mentality that nothing in policing would prevent crime. We've moved to great optimism in criminology about certain kinds of strategies, certain strategies that actually do work to prevent violence. Now, I'm talking about policing specifically. There are other sorts of interventions that will work. But they are typically are not the sorts of things that you hear ideologues on either end of the spectrum talking about. On the left, we usually hear about attacking root causes of crime, root social causes of crime. If we didn't have such deep poverty, we wouldn't have such horrible crime. Undoubtedly true, or there's a great correlation there. That's undoubtedly true. But as a crime fighting strategy, as an immediate violence prevention strategy, it doesn't hold a lot of promise. The left focuses very heavily on curtailing police abuses because we've had an overreaction by police in our cities to crime. That has caused all kinds of social problems. It has caused mass incarceration. The response is to restrain the police, to tamp that down, to do away with strategies that caused such widespread arrests. That, however, hasn't necessarily had a beneficial effect in preventing crime. It also, the famous example is in New York, where there was such heavy use of stop and frisk policing, stopping everybody, especially young black men, on the street, when it was essentially done away with, thanks to a federal court order. It had no effect on the crime. The crime continued to go down. So it sort of put the lie to whether that was one of the causes. But the flip side isn't necessarily true. And that's where the left often comes up short in not being able to come up with solutions that would make an immediate difference in crime because they don't really want to give a lot of credence to what the police have to say. On the right, we've been living under the policies that sort of are championed by the right, which is aggressive policing, militarized kinds of policing, mass incarceration, mass arrests, filling our prisons with millions of people more than we used to. And it's been shown conclusively. The National Academies of Science study in 2014, it's a very thick volume. If you ever want to wade through it, it's just page after page of evidence of how those policies did not cause the majority of the crime drop since the 90s. Maybe as much as 25%, maybe, but that's even a stretch. And since the 90s, probably not nearly that much of a factor. Those policies have been proven again and again not to be the cause of the drop in crime, not to be effective at doing what we want to do. So the key question is, if dialing punishment up or down doesn't really solve the problem, what sorts of policies would? And I want to focus on the media role before I run out of time here. In Lois Beckett's ProPublica story that I asked the class that I shared with the class, it talked about the resources that are put behind mass shooting and urban violence. And it used a really, I think, perfect example of a program that has been proven to work. I've written about it in several cities, LA and New York included. But it's a form of deterrence. It's called focused deterrence. It often flies under the brand of Operation Ceasefire. But in Lois Beckett's ProPublica story, she talked about how it had the resources, but those resources disappeared. And that has happened time and again, where police and social workers working together identify the small number of people who are responsible for the vast amount of violence in a particular neighborhood. They call them in, they threaten them, they use deterrence to say if any more violence occurs, we are going to take care of everybody in this group, in this crew. But at the same time, they offer a carrot. And the carrot is that we're going to help you get out of this lifestyle. We're going to give you resources that you lack. The reason that you're in this in the first place is because you don't have anything else. We're going to give you other things that are going to make a difference in your life. And it strikes cops who hear of it for the first time. It strikes outsiders who hear of it for the first time as just hopelessly naive. Please stop shooting. And we're going to give you a job. We're going to give you a job training. And even in Stockton, California, we were talking about this earlier, they're giving out $1,000 checks to guys who are known to be dangerous, to be carrying guns on the street. And they're saying, we're going to pay you not to commit crime. And that offends people because it sounds crazy, rewarding bad behavior. The fact is that these strategies have actually made a noticeable, a measurable difference, radical difference in some cities immediately in cutting violence, time after time after time. But just as consistently, the cities that have used these strategies have given up on them because people think they sound crazy, they don't put the resources behind them that they need. And at a certain point, you have to ask yourself, is it because we don't see the problem and don't see what's working? Or is it because we really don't actually care about the most common crime victims who exist, the most threatened people in our midst, in our cities, who don't get the kind of help that we actually know will work? There's a long list of policing strategies that we know will work, that have been used successfully in many, many cities, but time after time they are abandoned. They are not given a proper chance to work. And at a certain point, you just have to ask yourself about why that might be. One of the most basic assumptions that we all make is that, of course, crime victims want punishment as their justice, that that's what's going to satisfy them. And so even if it doesn't work to reduce crime, it's at least justice. It's the just desserts for those people who have harmed them. The survey that I recommended that you read from the Alliance for Safety and Justice, that survey, which by the way has been echoed in results in Illinois and California. Californians for Safety and Justice started surveying victims of color in particular. Overwhelming majority said what? Said, we don't actually care as much about punishment as we do about getting some services and getting crime prevention, fewer victims. We don't want people to go through what we've gone through. That's what we want. We care whether somebody is held accountable. We care whether somebody, in fact, most victims probably care whether somebody is punished. But whether they're punished 10 years or 20 years, that's the debate we've been having in this country. Well, 10 years isn't enough. It must be 20. It must be life without parole. We just keep stacking up those penalties while at the same time we see data in these surveys that show that crime victims don't actually care about that. This looks like an ad for my friends, but I want to close with a little bit of hope. I started out by talking about the bad kind of crime coverage, the kind of media sensationalism that makes people think that the whole world is falling apart, the whole world is dangerous, and that only certain kinds of crime victims matter. There is really thoughtful, in-depth crime coverage that's happening in this country, and it's happening to a really striking degree. I track it very closely because it's my job, And it's really literally overwhelming. You can't possibly read every in-depth story that comes out every day about crime prevention, about criminology, about the social issues that are surrounding these sorts of things. I give a lot of credit to the Marshall Project, which was started by, which was run by Bill Keller, who came from the New York Times. The New York Times at the same time has really increased its coverage of these sorts of things. There's a young man at Vox named German Lopez, who's really done a very thoughtful job. About every 2 weeks, you'll read a long feature story by him, deeply reported stories about these sorts of issues, about what kinds of crime prevention actually work, what kinds of policies have or haven't made a difference. I mentioned Lois Beckett before. She's now at The Guardian, covering gun violence and gun policy, doing a really good job, and actually a very not just from one point of view either. She's surprised gun rights advocates with some of her coverage. The Crime Report just had a conference I spoke at 2 weeks ago at the Guggenheim Symposium in New York at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. It was a gathering of dozens of journalists who cover these policy issues, who don't just chase the if it bleeds, it leads news, who really cover the issues. There are dozens of these people. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's more than it used to be. The Trace I mentioned, covering gun violence. A lot of these are nonprofits. In fact, the Crime Report, the Trace, and the Marshall Project are all nonprofits, which says a lot about where the media industry has gone. But the good news is that there is tons of serious coverage of these issues. The question is whether there's a market for it, whether there are enough people who will care about reading these sorts of stories and caring about the policy issues, who will pay attention to it. There's a movement called solutions journalism. In fact, you can go to the website solutionsjournalism.org that talks about not just crime, but all sorts of social issues, and tapping into the research and writing journalism about these serious topics, and not just throwing problems at people, but saying, it isn't just about fear. It isn't just about problems. There are actual solutions. There are solutions in urban violence. They actually work. And if more people write about them, I have a hope that it isn't just a small crowd of people talking to each other about what might change, but that the punitive kinds of attitudes that are baked into our politics, that are baked into our public opinion, that those attitudes might change if facts enlighten people.
Thank you, Mark. Question? Feel free to call.
Louis, yeah, I'm surprised you haven't graduated yet, Louis. My God, every time I'm here.
45 times. Do you look at all crime as crime, or do you look at blue-collar crime different than white-collar crime? But it's crime. And how do you prevent it in a society that is purified, this great society that everything is pure? And how do you prevent it? Don't you start to worry about preventing rather than reporting it? Isn't that the first element of a society?
Well, my focus is on violence. It's just my particular passion is to write about what I consider the most serious problem, and the thing that affects crime victims the most. And yes, I think everything that I have been talking about is aimed at one thing, which is that crime prevention instead of punishment is really what will make a big difference in victims' lives. That's really where we ought to be putting our attention. We ought to be helping victims of crime with the kinds of services that we don't bother to provide to them now.
How do you prevent the victim part of it?
Well, you prevent.
It's a difficult, non-resolved question.
I mean, these are.
How do you prevent the victim part of it?
I mean, these are deeply complex social problems. We can't wave our hand. We aren't We don't all have the superpowers of Donald Trump to wave our hand and say it's going to change because I dictate that it will. He, by the way, said that he could solve the problems in Chicago in 1 week. In 1 week, by just getting a little tougher. By just getting a little tougher. I'm hoping that week is coming up soon. I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. The serious point is that these are really complex problems, and they aren't easily solved, and they aren't even easily understood. They differ from neighborhood to neighborhood. And so all we can do is look at what the evidence is about what kinds of things have worked in most places or many places, and try to replicate those and try to give them the resources that they need to succeed. And I think that journalism that puts the spotlight on those sorts of solutions is a better cause than just writing about and showing the mayhem that scares us all and that makes people overreact with punitive responses.
So, Mark, one thing I was wondering about, so in the course of your presentation, you began talking about good victims and bad victims. You raised the question about reorienting our thinking by getting us to think about the conditions under which choices are made, and that where you ended with the focused deterrence and good journalism are two different ways of calling attention to the constraints on choice that people have. But what happened in between those two bookends, one of the things you described was a long drop in crime across the board, all kinds of different crimes all over the place, that presumably was happening without this understanding or shifting towards the context in which choice is exercised. So I know there's it's not clear what caused that trend, but in all your voluminous research and reporting, what do you think are the best explanations for this long-term decline in crime rate? And how do you connect that with your perspective or advocacy for the shifted perspective on the problem that crime is and how we should address it? So just a small question.
Yeah. I'll take another couple hours. Well, the point I was trying to make about the hierarchy of victims is that when we don't care about the most common kinds of victims, we end up just feeding these cycles of retaliatory violence, dysfunction, trauma. We inflict more pain on these communities, and we get back that in future generations of problems. And so even if we cannot find compassion for certain kinds of victims, and obviously people who harm others and who put themselves in harm's way don't deserve as much compassion from us, but it's not just about compassion, it's about what strategies work. And if we just ignore them and allow that to happen and think that only punishment and heavy kinds of policing will make a difference, then we're just going to see these things continue to churn. The scholarly community, and of which I am not a part, just an avid reader, really has not come to any clear consensus on what has caused this dramatic decline, overall decline in all kinds of crime. And by the way, it's pretty much worldwide. It isn't just in the United States. The United States has far more crime than most other places for one simple reason, guns. But there are tons of factors that go into this about, that are demographic changes. Fewer young men means less violence. Economic factors, but policing, I believe, the thing that I have focused the most on, has made a difference in a lot of places. Effective policing. And there's a really strong progressive policing movement in this country, at least at the top of major police departments and mid-sized police departments. Police who understand this and who understand that if they earn the trust of the most harmed communities, that they will see an improvement in the job that they do with a real marriage of community and police. That exists at the top of these police departments. It hasn't made its way all the way down into the ranks. But that's what everybody's trying to figure out, is how can we keep this going? Where's the bottom? We're afraid that we have hit the bottom in some places and we're bouncing back up, but that isn't necessarily true. And I think the people who are working on this are trying to make it go back down again. Yes.
It's interesting that as crime rates have declined, perceptions of crime rates remain steady.
Right.
Higher. And I wonder how much of that is the result of the media.
Well,
And how much the political climate have the same idea.
sure.
Second question also. About long-range solutions, there's ample evidence that high-quality, full-day, universal pre-K for 3 to 4 year course that's started early has a dramatic impact on incarceration rates and the quality of children as they grow.
Right.
I haven't seen very much reporting on that with reference to crime.
Nor have I. I am aware of those studies, and I know that they dovetail with the kinds of childhood trauma study that I alluded to. And there are lots of social programs that would make a long-term, noticeable, important impact. And I always struggle in how to articulate my feelings about why I emphasize shorter-term policing strategies and police community strategies. It's simply because there is an urgency that matters a great deal to the people who are in jeopardy. And if we only focus on the long-term social fixes, we won't deal with that short-term emergency. I've sat in the room with the victims who are debating how are we going to afford funeral expenses for everybody in this room because there are just so many dead young people. That's an urgent crisis that doesn't call for a discussion, at least in the moment, about something that will take a long time to germinate. These things have to happen at the same time, obviously, but the near term is really what I think is important to focus on in a positive, constructive way instead of the way that the press has typically dealt with it, the popular press at least. The sorts of wonky things that I'm pointing to, have a tiny audience. The mass audience is being is watching, not reading, stories about mayhem, and there are studies that show whether this has an effect. You have to believe that it does have a strong effect on people's fear of crime. To see that lead the news every night, you're going to just worry about your city. You're going to worry about other cities. Chicago is in the center right now. That it feeds on itself, and it's really popular politics. We've seen its resurgence just recently, just really, really recently. I'm trying not to talk only about him. Okay. I'm really trying hard. Other questions? Yes, sir.
And so to feed off the media question, then you're saying it needs to be better type media sources like the ones you showed, although they have a small audience.
Right.
And I feel, and to kind of like tap into the other question, the media is almost self-cannibalizing in this, in that you have certain sectors that are doing a good job. It's going to be outweighed by these other ones that are going to tap into more of what a larger audience is going to want. So I'm wondering if it needs to be just more than media. It needs to be an education side of it to educate people that these base fears you have about rising crime is incorrect. And then from a law side, you showed the mugshots. I know in the European context that you can appeal to get some of these things taken down. So that Google has to take them down, so we don't have to go down the extortion route.
The right to be forgotten, right? Yeah.
So I guess my question is how can media work with other sectors such as law, policy, and education?
It's foolish to think that we can corral all forms of media and get them to behave. That's never going to happen. It's never happened before. If you think the press now is irresponsible, you should read some 18th century newspapers writing about crime. But there have to be more quality sources, and we have to make them more interesting and not just appealing to college professor elites, but to average people, and make these facts better known. That's a long slog, and I don't really have I wish I knew how you can how that can seep into the culture. Your point about education is well taken. If we taught people more about how this stuff really works and what's really going on and what has been going on in this country, good and bad, with facts, it could make a difference in public opinion. Yes, sir.
So do you think the media should turn from being just reporting on the issues and being like, there's so much crime and just causing so much polarization, rather saying, this happened, this is how we should do it? Or do you think the media should be allowed to continue to do it and someone else should take the task of educating people on what to do with that?
No, I was advocating solutions journalism, the kind of journalism that advocates, it's not about ideology. It's about saying, this happened, this is an example of this problem, and this is how the problem has been dealt with in other places. This is what it means. These are the sorts of solutions, the sorts of strategies that make a difference in this sort of crime to help this sort of person. If there was more attention given to the solutions rather than just the problems, then people might actually realize that it's not hopeless. It's not total chaos. It is bad. It is serious. It needs attention, but it doesn't need panic, because what we've gotten from panic is really full prisons with a lot of crime still, and we don't get at the real problems when we make decisions based on emotion. Yes.
How do you take that idea, that three-part idea, and implement it via a local newspaper, a local television station, even a college radio station?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get that philosophical bent over to the people who make that decision, and for them to say, this is going to be the way we're going to report these stories?
Well, the organization that I mentioned, Solutions Journalism, is doing that in the media world. It is spreading this message. It's archiving examples of the best kinds of stories on multiple topics, and it is taking it on the road. It's going into newsrooms and teaching reporters how to do this better. I mean, it's a really tough time to be doing this, because there's been the ranks of journalists at the local level have been decimated because the business is in such trouble. And so it's a very awkward time to go to news directors and editors and say, you really need to let Roy, the reporter, spend 2 months on this big project instead of chasing fire trucks all day. That's going to be a hard sell. But it is happening. If you go to investigative reporters and editors and look at the awards page, the kinds of projects that are being done all the time at the local level, these are not typically national stories. They're local stories by even television stations. I tend to talk about the word side, but the TV side, which is far more popular. There's really important work, good work being done on crime and lots of other social issues. And that's just one example. You can look at any national awards page and you'll be inspired, overwhelmed even by the amount of good journalism. We like to generalize, all of us like to generalize about, oh, the media do this and the media do that. There are good journalists. There are good examples of quality journalists, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. I don't mean to portray my craft as having reached the finish line, but there is enough good that if we point to it and we use it to fact check people who tell lies about these sorts of things, and we point to constructive, solutions-based stories instead of alarmist, doomsday stories, we might make a difference in how people think.
We are out of time. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.